The paper was cold. That was the first thing Garrett Dole noticed. Not the boy's face, not the gymnasium's buzzing fluorescent light overhead, not the social worker standing 3 feet back with her clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. The paper. A single sheet, pale blue, the kind schools used for permission slips and lunch menus, and the boy was holding it in both hands the way you hold something you are afraid to put down because putting it down would make it permanent. The boy had been standing in the same spot on the gymnasium floor for 40 minutes. Nobody had told him to stand there. Nobody had told him to stay. He had simply chosen that square of hardwood and refused to leave it, and every adult in the building had walked a wide arc around him, the way water moves around a stone. There were 200 names on the sheet he eventually handed over. 200. The gymnasium held maybe 60. You need to understand what it meant that there were 200, and you need to understand what kind of men wrote them down, and you need to understand why an 8-year-old boy with no family and a torn sneaker and a permission slip asking him to list his emergency contacts was the one who broke open a chapter of the Northgate Riders that nothing else in 30 years had managed to crack. The reason nobody expected that is the part that will stay with you. The day started the way most Tuesdays started east of the Black Hills, which is to say it started cold and flat and without ceremony. The sky over the open grassland outside Sturgis was the color of old pewter, a low ceiling that turned the late October light into something thin and apologetic, good for nothing except reminding you that winter was coming, whether you had prepared for it or not. The frost had come in hard overnight. It silvered the dried-out grass along the county road and put a skin of ice on the puddles in the gravel lot behind the Northgate Riders chapter hall, a converted machine shed on the Dole property that smelled permanently of motor oil, wood smoke, and the ghost of someone's breakfast sausage from a morning years ago that had simply never left the rafters. Garrett Dole was 51 years old. He stood 6 feet and 1 inch in his boots and weighed what a life of physical work produces in a man who never got soft but never got vain about it either, which is to say he was broad through the chest and thick through the forearms and carried none of it lightly. His beard was dark going gray at the jaw, trimmed close enough to show the line of his chin but wild enough to show he hadn't looked for approval in a long time. His hands were a geography of old repairs, a ridge of scar tissue across the left palm from a belt drive incident in his 30s, knuckles that had been broken and reset and broken again, fingernails that a full week of scrubbing would not entirely reclaim from the dark crescent of grease embedded beneath them. He was the oldest man in the Northgate Riders by 4 years. He had long ago stopped holding office. He didn't need to. He had been riding out of this particular stretch of grassland for 22 years, and there was not a man in the chapter who would make a significant decision without first watching to see what Garrett Dole did with his eyes when the idea was floated. That Tuesday morning he was not doing anything significant. He was replacing a brake line on a 2009 Road Glide that belonged to a younger member named Cortez Webb, and he was doing it alone. And he was doing it the way he did most things, which was steadily and without speaking and without needing the radio on. The chapter hall was empty except for him. The other members had obligations, jobs, families, the ordinary Tuesday infrastructure of lives that existed alongside the cut. Garrett had obligations too. He simply chose to handle his before 7 in the morning and use the remainder of the day for the shop. He had been doing this for years. He preferred it. He did not know, at 7:43 in the morning while he bled the caliper and watched the clear fluid go amber in the tube, that by 9:15 he would be parked in the lot of Whetstone Elementary School and that a boy he had never met would be holding a blue permission slip in both hands, and that the permission slip would be asking for something that should have been simple. It was not going to be simple. The call came through Denny Frisch, who was the chapter's informal liaison to the county, which was a title nobody had given him but everybody recognized because Denny had a brother-in-law in the sheriff's department and a cousin who worked the front desk at the district school board office, and a natural talent for being in places where information passed from one person to another. Denny called Garrett's cell at 8:52. Garrett wiped his hand on a shop rag before he answered because that was the kind of thing he did without thinking. "You near the school on Whetstone Road?" Denny said. It was not a question. "I'm at the shop," Garrett said. "My cousin called. They've got a situation over there with one of the kids, a boy. You know how they do those emergency contact forms at the start of the year and then again in October for the conference records?" Garrett set the shop rag on the bench. "I know what they are. This kid handed his back blank. Counselor asked him why it was blank, and the kid said he didn't have anyone to put on it. Just said it like that, like he was telling her the sky was gray." Denny paused. "He's a ward of the state, been bouncing placements since June. The current one fell through last week. He's been sleeping at the emergency shelter on Birch Street." Garrett was quiet for 3 seconds. The chapter hall was very still. "What's his name?" Garrett said. Marcus Lyle, 8 years old." Garrett set his phone on the workbench next to the shop rag. He looked at the brake line. He looked at his hands. He picked the phone back up and said, "Call the others." "How many?" Garrett thought about the blue form. Blank. An 8-year-old boy standing next to a blank form, explaining it the way you explain something that is simply true. "All of them," he said. He pulled his cut off the hook by the door and was in the parking lot before Denny had finished saying goodbye. The Electra Glide turned over on the first try. The cold air hit the back of Garrett's throat like gravel as he cleared the gravel lot and pointed the bike toward Whetstone Road, and the grassland on either side of the county road was silver and frozen and going nowhere, and the sky above it was the same gray it had been at first light, relentless and indifferent and very, very wide. The school secretary's name was Paula Reams, and she had worked the front desk at Whetstone Elementary for 11 years, and she believed, with the conviction of someone who had absorbed 11 years of evidence, that she had seen every variety of situation a small school in a county like this one could produce. She had managed custody disputes conducted in the parking lot. She had managed the arrival of 3 different grandmothers on the same day, each claiming primary authority over the same child. She had managed a father who brought a goat to a school event because there had been a miscommunication about what kind of animals were welcome and who had decided the best resolution was to simply proceed. Paula Rimes was not a woman who startled easily. When Garrett Dole walked through the front doors at 9:11 in the morning, she startled, not because of the size of him, though the size of him was considerable, and not because of the beard or the cut or the Northgate Riders patch over his left chest. She startled because he walked straight to her desk and put both hands flat on the counter and looked at her without any of the social machinery that people usually deploy when they walk into a place they are not sure they are welcome, which is to say he did not smile and he did not apologize, and he did not explain himself before she had a chance to ask. He simply looked at her and waited. "I'm here about Marcus Lyle," he said. Paula's hand moved 2 inches toward the phone. She stopped it. "And you are?" "Garrett Dole. I know your boss, Jan Ferreira. You can call her desk." Paula looked at him for a moment. He did not look away. He did not shift his weight. He held the counter with both hands, the way a man holds something he does not intend to let go, and his eyes were steady and dark and entirely focused on her face. She called Jan Ferreira's desk. The call took 45 seconds. When she hung up, she said, "The counselor's name is Miss Archaea, room 114. I'll take you back." What Paula Rimes thought when she walked this man down the hall is that she was making a mistake. What she felt was something else, something quieter and harder to name. The way you feel when you are watching an event, and you know before it finishes that you are going to be thinking about it for a long time. She walked him to room 114 and knocked twice and opened the door and stepped aside, and Garrett Dole walked in. Marcus Lyle was sitting in a chair beside the counselor's desk. The chair was slightly too large for him and his feet didn't reach the floor. He was wearing jeans with a frayed hem and a gray hoodie that was clean, but had been washed so many times the fabric had gone thin at the elbows, and his sneakers were the kind where the sole had begun to separate from the upper at the toe on the left foot. His hair was cut short, and he had a small scar, pale and old, at the corner of his left eyebrow. He was holding the blue permission slip in both hands, one corner bent from the grip. He was not crying. He looked like a boy who had made the decision some time ago that crying was a separate category of event from the kind of situations he typically encountered, and that decision had settled into his face as a kind of practical stillness. He looked up when Garrett came in, and he did not look afraid. He looked the way children look when they are tired of being the subject of conversations they are not allowed to participate in, which is to say he looked alert and patient, and slightly older than 8 years old. The counselor, Priya Archaya, stood up. She was a small woman in her 40s, with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and the expression of someone who was professionally obligated to manage her alarm. "Mr. Dole," she said, "thank you for coming. I want to be clear that we've contacted the state placement office and they are sending a caseworker, so the situation is—" "Can I sit down?" Garrett said. Priya Archaya stopped. Of course. There was a second chair against the wall. Garrett pulled it forward and sat down directly in front of Marcus Lyle, not beside the desk, not beside the counselor, but close enough that when he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, their eyes were almost level. The blue form was still in Marcus's hands. Garrett looked at the form and then looked at the boy. "That the one they want you to fill out," he said. Marcus looked down at the paper. "Yeah." "The part for emergency contacts." "Yeah." Garrett nodded. He looked at his own hands for a moment, the scarred ones, the stained ones, and then he looked back at Marcus. "What's your name?" The boy looked at him with the expression of a child who has answered this question so many times in so many offices that the question itself has become a kind of texture, like the feel of waiting room chairs. "Marcus." "Marcus," Garrett said. He said it the way you say a word when you want it to mean something specific. "I'm Garrett. I ride with a club called the Northgate Riders. We're based about 6 miles east of here, out past the county road. You know what a motorcycle club is." Marcus thought about it. "Like a gang." "Like a club," Garrett said. He didn't say it sharply. He said it plainly, the same way he said everything, and Marcus accepted the correction with a small nod. "How come you're here?" Marcus said. "Because a friend of mine heard you needed someone to talk to." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the form. He held it out to Garrett without saying anything, and Garrett took it and looked at it. The form had a header that said Whetstone Elementary School, Emergency Contact Record, and below that there were 4 blank lines, each with a label: name, relationship, phone number, address. All 4 lines were empty, not erased, never touched. Garrett held the form carefully. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes, not the form itself but the specific shape of the emptiness on it. His daughter's name had been Nell. She had been 9 years old when the car accident happened, 7 years ago now, on a road 40 miles south of here. She had survived it. He had not been with her. He had been in this very county at a chapter meeting, and his ex-wife had been driving, and there had been ice on the road near the Cheyenne River crossing. His ex-wife had walked away. Nell had not walked for 4 months. She had walked eventually, fully, without a limp, and she lived now in Rapid City with her mother and called Garrett on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays for no particular reason. She was fine. She was 16 and fine, and he was not permitted to stop being grateful for that. But the 7 years between that night and this morning had changed the architecture of him in ways he could not describe to anyone who hadn't felt their own architecture change, which was to say the accident had taken something from inside his chest and replaced it with a hollow that whistled when the wind was right. He had not been there. That was the specific shape of it. He had not been there, and that was not something he could repair, only carry. He looked at the blank lines on Marcus Lyle's emergency contact form. He folded the form once, carefully, along its existing crease, and set it on his knee. "Can I hold on to this a minute?" he said. Marcus nodded. Garrett reached into the chest pocket of his cut and took out his phone. He dialed Denny Frisch. Denny picked up on the second ring. "Where are you?" Garrett said. "Parking lot," Denny said. "Webb's here, Rooster's coming. Stritch brothers are 2 minutes out." "How many total?" 22 right now, more coming. You said all of them, so." Garrett looked at the form on his knee. He looked at Marcus Lyle, who was watching him with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. "Tell them to come in. Tell them to come in quiet and sit wherever there's a space, and tell them to bring whatever they've got to write with." He paused. "And tell Webb to stop at the office and ask Paula Rhymes for a pen." There was a silence on Denny's end. Then Denny said, "You're going to put names on that form." "I'm going to put names on that form," Garrett said. The door to room 114 opened 11 minutes later. The first man through it was Cortez Webb, 29, with his helmet still under his arm and a Sharpie in his hand. Behind him came Denny Frisch, 44, who had to turn sideways slightly in the doorframe. Behind Denny came a man the club called Rooster, whose real name was Gerald Polk, 55, and who was missing the tip of his right index finger from a sawmill incident in 1999, and who carried this fact the way most men carry nothing at all. The Stritch brothers, Liam and Calvin, came together as they always did. After them came 8 more, then 6, then another 4, until the room that had been designed for a counselor and 1 student at a time contained 22 men in cuts and boots who arranged themselves against every wall and sat on the floor where there was no wall available and waited. Priya Archaya stood with her back very straight and her hands folded in front of her and said nothing. Paula Rhymes had followed them down the hall and was standing in the doorway and also said nothing. The social worker who had arrived from the state placement office, a young woman named Bethany Cord, had walked into the hallway 20 seconds before the first man entered and had pressed herself against the wall and was writing something on her clipboard with the focused energy of a person who was not yet sure what they were witnessing. Marcus Lyle looked at the room full of men. He looked at Garrett. "These are your people," he said. "Yeah," Garrett said. "How many?" Garrett looked around the room. 22 right now, more on the way. Marcus looked at the men. Several of them looked back. Rooster gave him a nod of the kind that passes between people who understand each other without needing to explain why. Cortez Webb was turning the Sharpie end over end in his fingers, unhurried. "What are they going to do?" Marcus said. Garrett held up the blue form. "They're going to write their names down," he said. The social worker's name was Bethany Cord, and she had been with the state placement office for 3 years, and she had a specific vocabulary for situations like this one, a professional container of language designed to manage the moment when an unexpected variable entered a case. She stood in the hallway outside room 114 and wrote on her clipboard and used every piece of that vocabulary in the report she was composing in her head, and none of it was adequate. None of it was built for this. She wrote, "Spontaneous community response, 20-plus individuals, organized volunteer emergency contact structure, child visibly at ease, no safety concerns." She looked at what she had written. She drew a line through visibly at ease and wrote, "Settled." She drew a line through settled and wrote, "Not afraid." She stepped back into the doorway. Garrett Dole was kneeling on the floor in front of Marcus Lyle's chair with the blue form flattened against a hardcover book he had taken from the shelf, and Cortez Webb was beside him with the Sharpie uncapped, and Garrett was saying something to Marcus too quietly for Bethany to hear, and Marcus was listening with the expression of a boy who has spent a long time learning how to listen to things that matter, and is recognizing, very carefully, that this might be one of them. "Here's what I want to explain to you," Garrett said. He had the form on the book and the book on his knee. "This form is asking for someone to call if something happens to you at school. Someone who will come. You understand what that means?" "It means someone who shows up," Marcus said. "That's right." Garrett looked at the first blank line. "Name, relationship, phone number, address. Webb," he said. Cortez Webb crouched beside him and signed his name on the first line with the Sharpie. Garrett wrote Webb's cell number beside it, the number he knew from memory because he knew all of them from memory. For relationship, he wrote Northgate Riders. "Denny," he said. Denny Frisch came off the wall and crouched and signed his name, and Garrett wrote the number and wrote Northgate Riders and moved to the next line. The form had 4 lines. When the 4 lines were full, Garrett looked up and said, "Webb, you got more paper in that bag." Webb had a notebook. He tore pages out of it, and Garrett pressed them flat to the book, and they kept going. Rooster signed his name with the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man who had learned to write later in life than most people do, and who treated the act accordingly. The Stritch brothers signed together, one after the other. 8 more men signed. 6 more. The pages accumulated. Garrett kept them in order. He numbered each page in the upper corner, so they couldn't be rearranged. They had been at this for 20 minutes when the door to the hallway opened again and 4 more Northgate Riders came in, and behind them 3 more, and behind them a man named Walt Duggar who was 62 years old and had been riding with this chapter since before Garrett joined, and who drove a truck instead of riding because his knees had given out 5 years ago, but who nobody would have dared to suggest was anything other than fully present. Walt sat himself down on the floor against the far wall with the unhurried ease of a man sitting down in his own living room, and looked at Marcus Lyle across the room and said, "What's your name, son?" "Marcus," the boy said. "Walt Duggar," the old man said. "I'll be on the list." He said it without flourish. He said it the way you say a fact. By the time they finished, the pages numbered 11. Garrett stacked them and squared the edges against the book and counted. He counted carefully. He counted twice. He looked at Marcus. 207, he said. "That's how many names are on here. 207 people who will come if the school calls." Marcus was quiet. He looked at the stack of pages. He looked at Garrett. He said, "How will the school call all of them?" "They won't have to call all of them," Garrett said. "They call the first one. The first one calls the next. They've all got each other's numbers. The school makes 1 call and 207 people know in about 4 minutes. Marcus thought about this. He had the expression of someone testing a structure, looking for the weak points. What if the first one doesn't answer? Then they call the second one, then the third. Garrett looked at the boy steadily. "There are 207 names on this list, Marcus. The school would have to call pretty far down before they ran out." Marcus looked at the stack of pages again. He put his hand on the top page, not gripping it, just touching it the way you touch something to make sure it is real. The pages were warm from the handling, from all the hands that had held them. He left his hand there for a moment and did not say anything, and the room full of men did not say anything either, and the fluorescent light buzzed its single note above all of them. Then Marcus Lyle looked up at Garrett Dole and said, "Can you put yours on there too?" Garrett took the Sharpie from Cortez Webb. He turned to the top page. At the very top, above Webb's name, he wrote his own name in the space above the header line, where the form had no designated field, just blank paper, and he wrote his number, And in the space for relationship, he wrote what he wrote. He wrote it in his ordinary handwriting, which was not elegant but was clear, and it said, "Will come." That was a Tuesday in late October. What happened after it is not a short story, because things that matter rarely are, and because the Northgate Riders did not sign their names on a piece of paper and consider the job complete. That was not how they operated, and it had never been how they operated, and Garrett Dole especially had never in his life understood the gesture that was not followed by the thing the gesture pointed toward. Bethany Cord was 29 years old and had 3 years in the placement office, and had learned, in those 3 years, that the system moved at the speed the system moved, and that the right posture toward the system was professional patience. She stood in the hallway outside room 114 and looked at the stack of pages Garrett Dole had handed her, and understood that she was holding something that did not fit inside any existing category her training had prepared her for. An emergency contact form with 207 names on it, all of them with addresses, all of them with phone numbers, all of them with Northgate Riders in the relationship field. She put the stack carefully inside her clipboard folio. She looked at Garrett. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "What's on those pages is meaningful, and I can see that, and I don't want to diminish it. But Marcus has an open placement case, and the process for long-term contact authorization for non-family adults requires documented background screening, a home study if guardianship is being pursued, and—" "I know what it requires," Garrett said. Bethany stopped. "You've done this before." "No," he looked at her steadily. "But I know how to find out. You tell me what form gets filed first, and I'll start there this afternoon." She looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who looked like precisely the kind of man that the forms and the processes and the protocols had been designed around, designed to filter, and he was standing in a school hallway asking what form got filed first, and that specific combination of those two things made something shift in Bethany Cord's chest that she did not have professional vocabulary for either. She opened her clipboard folio and took out a card and wrote something on the back of it and handed it to Garrett. "That's the number for the Regional Child Placement Coordinator. Her name is Sandra Voss. She has the authority to fast-track authorized contact status for verified community support networks, which is a designation that technically exists in the code and is technically never used. She will tell you it's never used." Bethany looked at the card in Garrett's hand. "Tell her about the 207 names. The phone call to Sandra Voss happened that afternoon from the parking lot of the placement office on Main Street in Sturgis. Denny Frisch sat on his bike 3 feet from Garrett's and listened to Garrett's half of the conversation with the expression of a man who is watching something that is either going to work spectacularly or fail in a way that will require a different strategy, and who has learned over many years that Garrett Dole's phone conversations had a specific quality, which was that they were extremely short and produced results that were disproportionate to their length. The call was 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Garrett spoke in plain, declarative sentences. He did not raise his voice. He did not use the language of advocacy or appeal. He stated facts. There is a boy. His name is Marcus Lyle. He is 8 years old. He is at Whetstone Elementary. He has no emergency contacts. 207 members of the Northgate Riders have volunteered to serve in that capacity and are prepared to submit to whatever documented verification process is required. When Sandra Voss told him that the authorized contact designation for non-family community networks was technically available but had not been activated since its inclusion in the administrative code, Garrett said, "What would it take to activate it?" Sandra Voss told him. He wrote it on the back of Bethany Cord's card with the pen he always carried. "We can have all of that to your office by Friday," Garrett said. Sandra Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's a significant amount of documentation for a 48-hour window," she said. "Yes," Garrett said. Another silence. All 207. That's right, Mr. Dole, Sandra Voss said, and she said it the way people say a name when they are making a decision in real time and have not finished making it yet. And then she said, I'll have the packet ready to send to your designated contact by end of business today. Garrett said thank you and ended the call. Denny was looking at him. Friday, Denny said. Friday, Garrett confirmed. Denny exhaled slowly through his nose. That's background check forms, residency verification, 2 character references per person minimum, and a signed acknowledgement from each individual that they understand the terms of authorized contact status. 2 character references per person, Garrett said. He put the pen away. That's 414 character references for 207 people in 48 hours. Garrett started his bike. The engine came up even and steady. Okay, Denny said. He took out his own phone. I'll start the phone chain. The chapter hall was never designed to hold 207 people, a fact that became apparent at approximately 7:30 that Wednesday morning when the gravel lot was completely full and bikes were parked along the county road in both directions for a quarter mile, and the machine shed was at capacity, and men were standing in the cold outside the open doors drinking coffee from a gas station that Rooster had made 3 separate runs to, and were holding printed forms on clipboards and talking to each other in the low, practical voices of people doing a task that needs doing. Garrett had been there since 5 in the morning. He had set up the table with the packets Sandra Voss's office had emailed, printed on the chapter hall's machine that was old enough to sound like something being assembled from its component parts every time it ran, and he had organized everything by last name and clipped each packet and written each man's name on the outside with a marker, and then he had waited. They came because Denny Frisch called the phone chain the previous afternoon, and the phone chain worked the way it always worked, which was the way Garrett had described to Marcus. 1 call becomes 2 calls, becomes 20 calls, becomes the full count, and the full count does not require persuasion or explanation because the full count has been moving in the same direction for long enough that the direction is understood without being stated. They came from across the county and from the next county over, and one man drove from Rapid City and arrived at 5:40 in the morning and said nothing about the drive, just picked up his packet and found a surface to write on. Walt Duggar came at 6:15 and brought his granddaughter, who was 16 and had better handwriting than most of the men, and she sat at the table and helped people complete the character reference sections with the focused efficiency of a student who is used to paperwork and takes it seriously. Nobody asked her to be there. Walt had simply brought her, and she had simply begun helping, and that was the end of it. Cortez Webb was assigned to track completions. He had a roster, and he marked off each name as the packet came back to the table finished and signed and collated. By 9 in the morning, he had 112. By noon, he had 188. By 3 in the afternoon, he had 202. The last 5 came in at 4:30 and 4:40, and once at 5:15, from a man who had been working a double shift at the equipment yard and signed his forms in the cab of his truck in the parking lot and walked them in with grease on his cuffs and said, "I'm the last one." And Cortez checked his roster and confirmed it and said, "You are," and the man said, "Good," and left. Garrett drove the completed packets to Sandra Voss's office at 5:45 that Friday and set them on her desk. Sandra Voss was a woman in her mid-50s who had worked in child placement for 23 years and who had, in those 23 years, seen the full range of what adults were capable of producing on behalf of children in the system, both the failures and the efforts. She looked at the stack of packets. She put her hand on them. "All 207, she said. 207, Garrett said. She opened the top packet and looked at the forms inside. The background check acknowledgement, the residency verification, the 2 character references, everything in order. She opened 3 more at random, the same. She set them down and looked at Garrett for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding whether to say the thing they are thinking. She said it. In 23 years, I have never seen this work the way it worked this week. Garrett did not say anything. I want you to know, Sandra Voss said, that I'm going to do my job, which means I'll run the verifications and process these in order, and it will take the time it takes. But I will tell you that Marcus Lyle's caseworker has been informed that an authorized community contact network is pending, and Marcus knows that the forms were submitted, and his caseworker told me this morning that when she told him, he asked how many. She paused. She told him 207, and he said, "That's everyone." Garrett looked at his hands on his knees. He thought about a 9-year-old girl in a hospital room 7 years ago, and the specific silence of arriving too late, and the way that silence had never entirely left the interior of his chest. He thought about a blue permission slip with 4 blank lines. He thought about 207 signatures accumulated in 48 hours in a cold machine shed on the open grassland east of the Black Hills by men who would have told you, if you had asked them, that they were just doing what needed doing. He's right, Garrett said. That's everyone. 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in early December when the sky above the county road had gone the particular deep blue that comes just before the early winter dark, Marcus Lyle sat in the front office at Whetstone Elementary and watched a woman from the state placement office carry a folder to Paula Rhymes's desk, and watched Paula Rhymes open the folder and look at the document inside, and then look at Marcus and say, "We need to call your contacts and let them know about the new placement arrangements." Paula opened the emergency contact file she had scanned and stored in the school system. The first name on the record was Garrett Dole. The relationship field said, "Will come." Paula dialed the number. Garrett's phone rang once. The months that followed worked the way the months tend to work when 207 people have agreed to be accountable for one small person's welfare, which is to say, they worked steadily and with effort and without spectacle, because that is what accountability is when it is real. The State Placement Office formalized the authorized community contact designation for the Northgate Riders chapter on behalf of Marcus Lyle in January, the first time the designation had ever been formally activated under the administrative code, a fact that Sandra Voss noted in the file with the dry precision of a woman who understood she was making a record. The background verifications cleared in order across the full 207 names. Marcus was placed with a foster family in the county, a couple named Ray and Cora Helt, who had been fostering for 12 years and who lived on a property 20 minutes from the chapter hall, which was not an accident because Bethany Cord had been thorough. He started at Whetstone Elementary in January on a Monday morning with new boots and a backpack that had appeared on the Helt family porch on a Sunday, with no note attached, and that Marcus immediately understood had come from the chapter hall. He wore the backpack every day without comment, which was its own kind of statement. Garrett saw him on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, and not by any formal arrangement, but because the Helt property was on a road that Garrett's usual Saturday ride passed close to, and after the first 2 Saturdays in which he had slowed down near the property and seen Marcus in the yard, Marcus had appeared at the end of the drive on the 3rd Saturday as though he had been watching, and Garrett had stopped, and Marcus had said, "Can I see the bike?" And Garrett had said, "Yeah," and that had been sufficient. By spring, Marcus had a specific spot at the chapter hall on Saturdays, a stool near the workbench where he sat and watched, and occasionally handed over a tool when Garrett asked for one, and Cortez Webb had taught him the names of about 40 different parts, and Rooster had told him 3 stories about roads he had ridden that were probably 70% accurate, and that Marcus had listened to with the serious attention he gave everything he decided was worth his time. Walt Duggar had taken to bringing his granddaughter on the Saturdays she was available, and she had begun teaching Marcus to play cards, a project in which Marcus was advancing rapidly and which Walt said boded nothing good for the future of anyone who sat across a table from him. The Northgate Riders held a formal vote in March. The vote was on a specific measure. The measure passed unanimously across the full chapter count at the time, which was 211. They stitched a small additional emblem to the chapter colors below the main patch, a patch the size of a hand that said simply 207, no explanation beneath it. None was needed by anyone who knew the chapter, and none would be given to anyone who asked, except to say that it was the number that mattered. The following October, on the Tuesday closest to the anniversary of the day Marcus Lyle had stood on a square of gymnasium hardwood with a blank blue form in both hands, the Northgate Riders rode to Whetstone Elementary School. All of them, every member in the chapter, and by then the count was 218, lined up in the parking lot in 2 columns, engines quiet, parked and waiting. Marcus was 8 years old when this began, and 9 now, nearly 10. And he came outside with his class and looked at the parking lot full of bikes and men, and looked at Garrett Dole, who was standing at the front of the column, and looked back at the bikes and said, "Is this all of them?" Garrett said 218. Marcus looked at the number for a moment the way he had looked at the stack of signed pages in October, with his hand almost reaching for them. Then he said, "That's more than last year." "Clubs grow," Garrett said. Marcus nodded. He went back inside and got his backpack and his lunch bag, and he walked out to where Garrett's bike was parked at the head of the column, and stood next to it. "Can we go?" he said. Garrett looked at him. The October light was coming in low and gold across the grassland to the east, the particular gold that arrives just before the cold sets in, and it caught the chrome on 218 motorcycles and scattered it in all directions, and the air smelled of frost and exhaust and the dried grass that the wind was carrying across the county road. Garrett looked at the boy standing next to his bike with his backpack on and his lunch bag in his hand, waiting, the way he had waited on a square of gymnasium hardwood with a blank blue form, the way he had always been waiting for something that he did not have a word for yet, only the shape of, which was the shape of someone who would come. "Yeah," Garrett said, "we can go. They say a man's measure is taken in the quiet moments, in the transactions that happen off the record and leave no receipt and ask for nothing in return." On a cold October morning in the open grassland east of the Black Hills, a boy stood alone on a gymnasium floor and held a blank piece of paper and told the truth about it, and the truth was so plain and so bare that it cut through every assumption and every armor in the room. You have stood in a parking lot and watched something arrive that you did not expect. You have felt the moment when a surface you had trusted to tell you what was inside turned out to be wrong. The Northgate Riders were 218 men who looked like one thing and were another. The paper that had been blank became the most crowded document that county office had ever processed, and the sound that had always been the loudest thing about those bikes, the engine, the exhaust, the road-filling roar of 218 machines moving together, turned out, when you listened for what was underneath it, to be something closer to the sound of someone saying, "We are here, we came. You are not a blank line anymore."